Welcome to Unit 6, Lesson 1. Today we're going to be talking about Part 1 of the digestive system. By Part 1, we're going to focus on the upper portion today. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify the key structures of the digestive system, describe 5 key functions of the system, identify the 4 layers of the digestive tract, and describe their respective functions. Identify the key structures of the oral cavity and their functions, explain how we swallow, and explain the role of the esophagus and peristalsis. So to begin with, let's look at an overview of the key structures of the digestive system. The digestive system can basically be divided into 2 key components. First, what is called the digestive tract. Or alimentary canal. And this is basically the tube from mouth to anus where food travels. The second part are what we call accessory organs. And these secrete substances. Into the digestive tract. But never contain food themselves. So if we're to take a quick look at the accessory organs, they include up here in the mouth, salivary glands, down here the liver, an organ that you can't really see in this diagram because it hides behind the stomach, but the pancreas, and hiding in under here the gallbladder. And they are all involved with secreting things into the digestive tract, but food should never be able to enter them. So we'll just quickly highlight salivary glands, liver, pancreas, and gallbladder. And we'll talk about these ones more next day. And then, of course, we have the digestive tract itself, and I'm just going to quickly color this in black, nice and dark. It's essentially this tube that passes all the way from our mouth. Still a continuous tube. Changes size and functions throughout, but it's a continuous tube. All the way through our small intestine, into our large intestine, and around and down through our colon and out our anus. So that's the two sort of key major components of the digestive system. And today we're going to focus on here, upper portion. Excluding the salivary glands, because we're going to focus on the digestive tract. Interestingly, if you ask most people what's the function of the digestive system, they'll very easily say, oh, it's to digest food. But actually, it involves 5 main functions. It's not just digestion. We break it down into a little more detail. So the first one is the process of getting food into your body. We might use this term, we say that someone blanked some poison if they've taken it in. If you came up with ingestion, excellent. So step 1 of the digestive system is ingestion, which is simply taking food into the body via the mouth. If you're being fed through a stomach tube or IV, this wouldn't include ingestion. It's the actual physical process of food entering the mouth. Then, what do you do with that food? Hopefully, so you don't choke, you chew it a bit. And that is the first step of digestion that most people think of. It's called mechanical digestion. Which is the breaking down of food into smaller pieces. Via physical processes. So you're not affecting bonds. You're just breaking it down, smashing it into little pieces. And why would we want to break food down into little tiny pieces instead of being one big chunk, aside from making it easy to swallow? If you said to increase surface area, you would be on target. So it's to increase surface area for chemical digestion. So we're going to want to digest this using enzymes, and the greater the surface area, the easier and faster we can do the chemical digestion. So instances of mechanical digestion starts in the mouth via your teeth, tongue, and even your cheeks. Which help to mix and grind food. When food is mixed in this way with saliva, it gets a special name. It becomes what we call the bolus. If you have any younger siblings who like to chew up their food and then open your mouth and say seafood, what you're looking at is that bolus, that ground up, yucky, saliva mixed bunch of food. And that's what we will eventually swallow. Mechanical processing also continues to occur in the stomach where rhythmic waves actually serve to churn the food. To continue breaking it down. And there's one more site of mechanical digestion. It's not really a site, but one more contributor to mechanical digestion. And this is the gallbladder. And it adds what's called bile to the small intestine. We'll just continue down here. And bile serves to emulsify fats. If you remember way back when we talked about different structures of fats, we talked about emulsifiers. That would be unit 2. And the fact that emulsifiers break fats apart into smaller droplets. So break the fat droplets into smaller droplets to increase the surface area. Okay. Following mechanical digestion, we get the stage where we actually start to break down the bonds between the food. And if you're catching on to what was said earlier, you can probably come up with chemical digestion. So this is simply the breaking down of chemical bonds in complex molecules to produce smaller absorbable molecules. In this case, we're often looking at something like a polymer going to a monomer by catabolism in some form of degradation, not necessarily just a hydrolysis. Via the assistance of enzymes. Okay. And I'm going to give you a list of examples of various enzymes and how they work. So, examples of chemical digestion. And we'll begin with in the mouth. And what pH is the mouth? Is it acidic, basic, or neutral? Think about how your mouth tastes. Sour, bitter, or neither in a general, not after you've just eaten anything, but in general. If you said it's neutral, you are correct. So in the mouth, where it's neutral, we have this form of chemical digestion. We start out with starches or complex carbohydrates, plus water. So this is a hydrolysis. The examples I'm going to give you are hydrolysis, but there's others out there. And it breaks it down into a disaccharide, maltose. And the enzyme responsible for this is called salivary amylase. And key, because it works in the mouth, which is neutral, it has to be in a neutral pH to work. Our next example, we'll look at the stomach. What type of environment is the stomach? Acidic, neutral, or basic? Very good. Acidic. And the key digestion, that chemical digestion that occurs there, is protein plus water turns into peptides. And this is courtesy of an enzyme called pepsin. I'm going to write it down here as pepsin, and then in brackets, ogen. Because pepsinogen is the inactive form, and then it becomes pepsin when it's activated. And we'll talk about how that occurs when we talk about the stomach in particular. Then most of the significant chemical digestion actually occurs in the small intestine. Which is a basic environment. This equals, we continue digesting starch even though we started it in the mouth. We didn't have enough time while it's in the mouth to actually finish the process. So we pick up and continue when we get into the small intestine. And again, we take those to maltose. But this time, instead of salivary amylase, we use something called pancreatic amylase. Pancreatic because it's made in the pancreas and then secreted into the small intestine. That maltose is then further digested. And do you remember what the building blocks of maltose were? It goes down into the monomer form of glucose plus glucose. And the enzyme for this is somewhat intuitive. It's called maltase. We also pick up and continue digesting protein. The job's not finished in the stomach. And we don't break it all the way down into its building blocks in its first step. We're still only getting to the peptide, shorter chunks of proteins. And this is done by an enzyme called trypsin. And again, I'm going to add the ogen in brackets because trypsinogen is the inactive form and it becomes active once it enters the small intestine. Those peptides then have to be further digested before they can be absorbed. So peptides plus H2O become amino acids. And there's lots of different versions of the enzyme that does this depending on the sequence of the amino acids, but in general we call them peptidases. Now, if you're keeping track, we had 4 major classes of biological molecules, and we've gone through the carbohydrates and the peptides, and what else is going to need to be digested? If you came up with fat, you are correct. And we digest the lipids or fat droplets produced by bile. Using several enzymes, but the key ones we're going to look at are a class called, it is intuitive, fat is part of what group? We said fats are part of lipids. It's digested by lipases. And it breaks it down into the key components. So what are the key components of a fat? A fat's backbone is, you say glycerol, very good. Plus, if we're talking a triglyceride, it's going to have tri because it has 3 fatty acids. And then there's one more class of biological molecules that we digest that we haven't talked about yet. So we've done carbohydrates, proteins, fats or lipids, and the last one, you said nucleic acids. You are correct. So this is DNA and RNA, which is in everything we eat. Plus H2O. And what do you think is going to be breaking up nucleic acids? If you came up with nucleases, you'd be correct. And nucleases break it down into what are the building blocks of nucleic acids. If you said nucleotides, excellent. But nucleotides in themselves aren't quite small enough to be absorbed usually. They often get broken down further. So nucleotides plus H2O go to, what are the 3 components of a nucleotide? You have sugar. What shape is that sugar? How many sides? You said a pentose sugar. Excellent. Either ribose or deoxyribose plus a phosphate plus, that's right, a base. And the fancy name for the enzyme that does this, they are called nucleosidases. And those are all the enzymes that we need to concern ourselves with for digestion. There's a lot more specific enzymes, but these are the major classes and what they digest. So we said how many steps or parts to digestion were there? We were going to talk about 5. So far we've covered 3. So what are the last 2 steps? What's the whole point of breaking all this down? If you said step 4, sort of the purpose for breaking it down was absorption, you'd be correct. And absorption is the process of taking up nutrients from the digestive tract into the cells lining the digestive tract, and eventually into the blank. What does it have to go into if it's going to be transported throughout the body? You said the blood? Excellent. So absorption, and this largely occurs in the small intestine. And we're going to look at some key features of the small intestine and how it's specially designed for this to occur. And then finally, the last step is, what do we do with that stuff that goes through our system but doesn't get digested? We have to remove it from our system, get rid of it. What's a fancy word for getting rid of something? You said elimination? You would be correct. So elimination is the removal of undigested waste from the digestive tract. This is not to be confused with excretion. Okay, so we're going to put a little note here. We're going to do a whole unit on excretion. Excretion is not a function of the digestive system. Excretion is the removal of metabolic byproducts from our body. This equals things like sweat and urine. And the difference is, in elimination, what you are getting rid of outside of your body has actually never entered the cells of your body. They've just gone through the digestive tract. In excretion, things have been absorbed into the cells of your body, they've been processed through chemical pathways, and you've produced waste, which you now must release out of your cells and out of your body. Okay, so very important that we don't confuse the two terms. We will do a whole unit on the excretory system and how it works, because it involves our kidneys. Okay, so that's the 5 key functions of the digestive system. First, we have to ingest, then we do mechanical digestion, then we're set to do chemical digestion, at which point we can absorb what we've produced, and finally we can excrete anything that has not been able to undergo appropriate mechanical and chemical digestion. So assisting in all these processes is the digestive tract itself, and the digestive tract actually has 4 key layers. So let's remind ourselves, digestive tract is simply the tube from blank to blank. Yes, here's your opportunity to say a fun word. From mouth to anus. and it has 4 key layers, each with distinct functions. And the first thing is this very center space. I'm going to color in black. This is where the food actually sits and travels. So that center canal is called the lumen. And then I'm going to recolor these things to help clarify what's what. The next layer out, better make it thicker. This is the first layer in contact with the food in the lumen. It's called the mucosa. What do you think the mucosa produces? You said mucus, you'd be correct. So the mucosa has what's called glandular cells. Which secrete enzymes and mucus necessary for digestion. So if this layer and these glandular cells are responsible for secreting enzymes and mucus, what sort of organelles do you think these cells will have a lot of inside them? If you came up with something like a lot of rough ER, because they're having to produce enzymes to be secreted, and lots of vesicles, you'd be correct. Okay, so this is a good way I could look at it on the test and see if you're able to start putting the different units together. I could give you a picture of a cell with lots of these organelles and say, which layer would this be likely found in? The next layer, I'm going to color blue because that's what's already colored. So we'll just highlight this. Is called the submucosa. Sub meaning below, and I know because we're looking outside it doesn't really look like it's below, but if you were moving from the lumen outwards, the submucosa is outside or below the mucosa. And the submucosa is really full of the blood vessels and lymph, necessary for nourishing the tissues and also for picking up the nutrients. So the submucosa is much more prevalent in the small intestine where a lot of absorption is occurring. The next portion we have, actually is all of this layer here, but it's almost two layers in one, because this represents rings back and forth going around and around the tract, and then here you have fibers that run lengthwise on the tract, and this is called the muscularis. What do you think the muscularis is made out of? Yeah, you guys are smart enough to figure out that's going to be muscle. And it has circular muscle, which essentially contracts and relaxes to open and close the tube. And longitudinal muscle, the fibers that run up and down. Which basically lengthens and shortens the tube. And together, these two muscles actually perform what's called peristalsis. Which is rhythmic muscle contractions, which we'll define later on. So it's rhythmic muscle contractions which actually propel or move food along the digestive tract. And then the last layer we'll color it purple, the outermost layer. We're running out of room, but we'll be able to fit it in. Down here. It's called the serosa. And if you ever watch operations on, like Discovery Channel, programs like that, and you see when they open up the body, it looks all kind of shiny inside and moist. This is courtesy of your serosa layer, and it is a very thin layer of cells, 1 to 2 thick, that secrete what's called serosal fluid, which lubricates the intestines so that they do not chafe as you move. Okay. And here is just a picture of how these layers vary in thickness throughout the digestive tract. Depending on what the function of that region of the digestive tract is. So we'll just go back up here for a second and show you this same picture, just looking at a cross section. If we were to cut the tube through the tube, we would see the lumen. This is the space where the food would be. then we would have the serosa, sorry, not the serosa, the mucosa, my mistake there, the mucosa, and then we would have the submucosa, and then the muscularis with its circular layer, and then its longitudinal layer, so these are fibers running lengthwise. And then finally, you would have your serosa. Like this. And then if you look down here, you can see the esophagus, which is mainly concerned with moving stuff, has a really thick muscularis. Whereas the stomach, which does a lot of secreting, has a big amount of mucosa. So it varies depending on the function of that section of the digestive tract. Okay, so now we're going to look more at the details of the tract itself and what various parts of the tract do. So we'll start with the oral cavity, or what we more affectionately term our mouth. And I'm just going to color up here, color it blue because the air comes in here. We're just going to color the nasal cavity, which isn't part of our digestive system. It's very important we understand how they are separated from each other. And when they aren't, it's quite painful. If you've ever, been laughing and had some food come through your nasal cavity, you'll know that's not a comfortable situation. So this is our nasal cavity. And for the most part, food should not enter our nasal cavity thanks to what we affectionately call the roof of our mouth. The official name for that, though, I'm going to color part of it. Just while you're writing this, take your tongue and right behind your top teeth, push against the roof of your mouth. See what that feels like. Now, move your tongue, roll it back towards the back of your throat, and again push against the roof of your mouth. What does that feel like? If you get your tongue far enough back, you will notice there's a distinct difference in what it feels like. So the front should feel bony and hard, and it is called your hard palate. And it's made of bone, and it separates the oral cavity from the nasal cavity. And at the back, you have your soft palate. And this is actually made up of muscle. And they work together with this little piece that hangs down at the bottom here. I'm just going to color it in black, which is called your uvula. And they work together to prevent things from entering your nasal cavity. The uvula is basically, if you watch cartoons and they show someone screaming and there's like this little punching bag hanging down in the middle of the back of the throat, vibrating back and forth, that is your uvula. Okay, or it represents the uvula. The last key feature of this diagram is this, which is your tongue. And then what's not very clear on this diagram are also the fact that we have teeth in here. Draw a few teeth sitting over top. So if we look at the functions now that we see what's what labeled here, we have our soft and hard palate, separate nasal and oral cavities. To the soft palate and uvula actually work together to prevent what's called nasal regurgitation. This is when food, pop, that type of thing comes up out of your nose. Your tongue, which serves several functions in terms of digestion, many more in terms of speech, but they help, or it helps, mechanical digestion, along with teeth and cheeks. It's also necessary for swallowing. It moves the food towards the back of our mouth. And it's essential for taste, which helps us to enjoy food and avoid things that aren't good for us. As well, not shown in this picture here because it sort of overlaps this inner cheek and under our tongue, and we'll talk about it more in detail of the accessory organs. We have our salivary glands. And these help mix food with liquid so that it's easier to swallow. What do we call that chewed up ball of food mixed with our saliva? You said bolus? You are correct. And it also helps to begin chemical digestion of complex carbohydrates such as starch. The next portion of the digestive tract we're going to look at is called the pharynx. And the pharynx is this region at the very back of your throat. And circle it like this. Square it, I guess, would be more appropriate. Okay. It's at the back of the oral cavity. You take a close look in the mirror, open up your mouth, maybe get a second mirror to get the right angle. You can see the very back. Some of you will be aware of the very back because it's close to where your tonsils are. Okay? The important function of the pharynx is it's where food and air must cross paths. Whether it was evolution or you believe God that created us, regardless, this is not one of the finer moments of our design. Because when they don't cross appropriately, we either get choking, equals food's gone into the air path, or we get burping, which is air's gone into food's pathway. Now there's other reasons for burping as well, but this is one of them. So very important, if we're going to look at the path of food, we'll draw food in green. Food should pass through the mouth. Oh, that didn't turn green, sorry. Should pass through the mouth. Come down towards the back and down the back here, which is the esophagus. In contrast, air is supposed to come in through the nose, come down here, cross pathways in the pharynx, and go down the trachea. And we have mechanisms for trying to prevent them from going down the wrong tube. Okay? So first of all, we have to clarify the names of a few parts. Okay? Right here, right in this area here, is the opening to trachea, which has a fancy name called the glottis. And when we swallow, the glottis needs to be covered. And the glottis is covered by, I'm going to color it red, a portion here. It's basically a flap called the epiglottis. Flap covering glottis. So how do we swallow? We can consciously control swallowing, but for the most part, it's a reflex action. Is a reflex or unconscious action that can be consciously controlled. And in order to swallow, tongue pushes back, and the soft palate and uvula move back to cover or close off nasal cavity so the food doesn't go up that way. At the same time, and you can do this, put your hand right on your throat where your Adam's apple is, easier for guys. Put it on your throat and feel what your trachea, what your trachea does as you swallow. The trachea is the front tube where the air goes down. And what happens is the trachea, the little epiglottis flap, it does not actually flap open or close. Indeed, it's your trachea that moves and closes it off. So the trachea moves up and under the epiglottis to close off trachea's opening so that food cannot go down the trachea. And when you find yourself choking, for some reason this hasn't occurred. And now, tongue continues to push back, forces bolus down the esophagus. Okay, and the final part of the digestive tract we're going to look at today is the esophagus. And we look at the esophagus. That's this portion of the tubeway leading down to the stomach. I'm just going to draw the little heart here. The heart's on the left side of the body, so we gotta draw it on this guy's left. His heart. There's a little piece here close to the heart that's going to be important. Okay. So the esophagus is probably one of the least complicated portions of our digestive system. It essentially is just a tube that links oral cavity to stomach. But it has a very well developed muscularis. for swallowing via peristalsis. I told you we would define peristalsis later in the notes, so here we are. Peristalsis is simply the rhythmic yet involuntary. Once they start, we don't control them. Contractions that move food through the digestive system. And importantly, at the base of the esophagus, where it can enter the stomach, there is what's called a sphincter. We have many sphincters in our body. And yes, it's a fun word to say. And what these are they are well developed circular muscles around a tube. At the far end of our digestive system, we do indeed have anal sphincters. And their function is, if they contract, what do you think they do to the tubeway? You say close it, you are correct. And in contrast, if the sphincter muscles relax, then it must, yes, you're brilliant, open the tube. And in particular, this sphincter at the base of the esophagus leading into the stomach is called the cardiac sphincter. Cardiac sphincter opens to allow food into the stomach and stays closed most of the other time. However, some people have the unfortunate condition which is termed heartburn, only because the location is similar to where your heart is. But what heartburn is the stomach acid leaking up through the cardiac sphincter into the esophagus. And a little bit of this, not, necessarily that concerning. But continual heartburn can be very concerning because that stomach acid can begin to break down the lining of the esophagus and eventually even burn a hole right through the esophagus. So people who have continual heartburn really should get it checked to determine if some form of surgery might be necessary to ensure that your sphincter works better. So that's the upper portion of the digestive system, and next day we will be talking about the stomach. If you have any questions about this, please come ask me. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day, and I will see you in class.